Hello, my name is Rainer Hanekamp. I am a trainer and consultant at Angular Architects, and this is a series about NgRx best practices. In this episode, we will be discussing a pattern that will prevent us from reloading data from the backend when we have it already in our state. So no more or less a simple cache. And at the same time, we will reuse this pattern to come up with some kind of readiness feature. By that I mean, if you have a component and the component says, I don't want to render right now because the data that I require is still not there, the effect is still waiting for the response, and that's why I just want to wait for now and render once the data is really ready. Definitely not the most common use case, but something that we might require from time to time. Let's take a look at it. So this is our application that we know already from last time. We see here that in the console, and every time an HTTP request is sent, that we're getting here an output. Now the problem is that the customers, but also the customer component itself, so this is the customer's component, this is the customer component, they are both dispatching the load action once they are rendered. And this has the effect that every time I'm switching between these two components, I am reloading the list of all the customers, which is not necessary because the customers don't change. And we also see this in the Redux dev tools that we have here a lot of loaded pairs. This comes from the way that this is implemented. And then we can also take a look at this readiness feature that I have mentioned before. And for that, let me add a delay to our loading method. So I'm going back to IntelliJ, and what I'm doing here is that I say whenever the get method is called, the mocked HTTP client should return the data with a delay of 3 seconds. And what will happen now is that if we reload the data, you see here a strange error message that says we don't have any customers yet. It vanishes, but it was still there. And that's the problem, because the customers component is requesting data from our state, the customers list. It gets it immediately. In the beginning, it will be an empty list because the request is still ongoing. And then the customers component doesn't really know what an empty list means. Does it mean that this is the initial state, so that the state is not really ready yet? Or does this mean that we really don't have any customer, and that's why we saw this message? And this is also something that we will solve in this episode. And it works like that. We will add a third action, which is the get action. The get action will be dispatched by the component instead of the load action. The load action now gets downgraded to an internal action. And the second addition that we have to make is inside of our state that we add an additional property which is called LoadStatus. The LoadStatus has 3 possible values: not loaded, loading, or loaded. And once the get action is dispatched, this means more or less that our components are telling state management, look, I have or I require customers now, but it is up to you to decide if this means that you have to load it from the data or if not. So this is the condition. If loading should happen or not is decided internally in NgRx itself. So when the get action is dispatched, the reducer does nothing. The only element that jumps in is the effect, because the effect will check now if a loading is required or not, and if it is required, then the effect will trigger the load action. Inside of the load action, we are doing the normal HTTP request, but in addition, the reducer is setting the LoadStatus property to loading. And this will prevent parallel requests going on. So if we say we have multiple components at the screen at the same time, and they are at this more or less at the same time firing or dispatching the get method, then this will prevent a multiple loading. Yeah, and when the data is returned from our backend, we just call the loaded action as before, and we also set the load status property to the value loaded. And this value can then be used by the component to find out if the state is now ready or not. So let's start by adding the get action. First of all, I will remove the delay again or set it to 0. And then I need to go to my customers action, and here I am defining this new action that I call get. So customer get, and of course I also export it. Then we said in our state we need to add an additional property. So this is done here in the state interface, and here I just say the property's name is LoadStatus, and it can have 3 different values. It can be not loaded, it could be loading, or it can be loaded. By default, or the initial state, not the default, the initial state is of course not loaded, and when the get action is dispatched, then the reducer does nothing, but the effect jumps in. And this means inside of our effect, we have here already the effects which are doing the loading, adding, and so on. We will be dealing now with the get method, or with the get action. And for that we create a new effect, create effect, where we say from our actions we want to have the one with get. There it is. What do we want to do with that? Well, first of all, we need to fetch the current load status. So there is something that's missing here. First of all, I need to inject the store. That's very easy. But the second step is that I don't want to select from the store directly, but I want to use a selector method, of course. So I go into my selectors, and there I say const select load status, create selector, from select customer state, and from there I just say you get the load status back. This is also something that I want to export, and yeah, then I reuse this in my effect again. So in my effect I have here the get method, and now I say with concat latest from, I want to select from customer, I want to have, no, select the load status, and then I think it's called from customers, an import statement. It's okay, it's from customer. And then I want to create a filter method, so I only want to continue if the load status value is set to not loaded. So that's why I'm using here a filter operator. I'm interested in the second one, and here I say load status is not loaded, and only if that is the case I am going to dispatch the actual load action. For customer actions, load, done. Okay. If the loading starts, then I need to go back into reducer. So once the load action itself is called, we need to make sure that no further HTTP request can be initiated. And that's why I say now, when you're doing the loading, or when you start with the load, please set the load status back to loading. Okay. I want to prevent multiple HTTP requests. And since we're already here, once the thing is loaded, we can also say load status is now set to loaded. Inside of our components, of course, we need now to change the action, because now they will dispatch the get action. So let me quickly go back. So in customer, we need to say dispatch get. And here we also need to say customer actions get. And now, if I didn't miss anything, it should already work. So let's quickly go back to our browser. There we are. We see here the initial HTTP request. If we click on the first customer, data is shown, but we also see that no additional HTTP request is taking place. And inside of our Redux DevTools, we have the same thing. So get is called multiple times. That's of course not a problem, but the load and the loaded, they are only loaded, they are only dispatched once. And now we can make sure, or we can deal with this problem of the readiness state, because what we have, well, what we still have is, let me put back this delay, and we still have here the problem that the customers component thinks there are no customers, and that's what we're also now going to solve. So I'm going back into my customers component, and everything that I have to do now is that I say I want to have a further observable where I say load status, and here I say load from customers. I select the load status, and then I will only start with the rendering of the list if the load status has the value of loaded. And the way that I'm doing this is I just go there. I say I create a new ng container where I'm putting the complete list. And inside here I say ngIf load status with the async pipe, and then I say if it is loaded. So, sorry for that. Okay, sorry, it took a while. And now we should have the final result where we are not showing a wrong error message, because now we really know if the list is empty, there are no real customers because the state is loaded, and otherwise we just show the list. So if we go back, and if we reload our page, we see add customer is just shown, but the list follows after 3 seconds because then we get the response from our backend. Now there is one thing that can make our life a little bit easier. If we are in a situation like the one that we are facing here, where all components that depend on this particular state are grouped under a certain root, then we can add a router guard that sits on top. And that router guard would only activate all its children, so all the components that require the customers, if the load status is set to loaded, and this guard can also dispatch the get method, because then all the components don't need to do that as well. So the way how this works is like this. I say I want to create a new guard, and I call this guard inside of our customers. I call this DataGuard, or whatever name you want to use. And I want to implement the CanActivate interface. So where is the guard? Ah, there it is. And what this guard is now doing, that in our constructor, we say we want to have the store. And for the activation, the guard says, I dispatch now the get action. So the customers should be loaded, and I will wait until the state is signaling me that a load status is set to loaded. And only then will I activate the actual child routes. So I do this by using our selector that we have already, that we also have in our customers component. So I say from customer, I want to select the load status. And now it is important that we add here a filter pipe, filter operator, sorry. Yes, please also import that as well. And inside of my filter, I say I only continue if the load status is set to loaded. Oops. Okay. And if that's the case, and everything that's left for me to do, that I return a true. So we're returning here an observable of a Boolean. So I can make this code a little bit shorter. It's just a Boolean, and we also we aren't interested in that as well. And then I can go back to all my components. At the moment I don't have so many, but it will make it a little bit easier here because I don't have to care about the load status anymore. I also don't have to dispatch the get action at all. Of course, I need to inject the store because I need the selector, and I can get rid of this ng container here that I have just created. So removing it. And the same is true for the detail component, so for the customer component, that also doesn't need to dispatch the get action anymore. That's now all handled by our DataGuard. So removing that, let's see, compilation took place. Let's go back. And what do we see? Actually nothing, because I didn't add the guard. Wonderful. So here we need to say CanActivate DataGuard, and now it should work. Yeah, that looks like it. So we see that the actual component takes a while. Of course, you can add here a spinner or something else. That's of course possible. And we should see now that when we change between the detail and the list component, that also the get action isn't dispatched anymore, because these two components lie under the same root. The get action is only dispatched if I switch to holidays or to home and then go back to customers. Then we only have the get, but of course never the load anymore. 3 things I'd like to add. First of all, you can of course use 2 actions instead of 3. So you put everything that the get action is now doing into the load action. That's not a problem. For me, the decision is always that I need to look at the code, and if I say, well, that's too much code for one particular action, then I want to split it up into 2 actions. So that's the main reason. If you say no, it's enough if everything is in the load action itself, then of course it's also fine. The second one, the load status, the readiness feature. This is something which is also very useful in very complicated or complex scenarios. Let's say we can't just use one HTTP request to construct the state, but that we have to use multiple ones. So maybe we need to run them in parallel, or maybe we need to run them in a sequential order, so that we first start with URL 1, after that we start with URL 2, and so on and so forth. And after 5 URL requests we are done and the state is ready. If this is something that you have in your application, the load status is a very elegant way how to solve this. And last but not least, this cache that we have implemented here, this is a very simple cache. It will not work if, let's say, if we have a list of customers that contains 10,000 customer entries. Of course, we would not load all of them, but only parts of it. And in that case, this cache will not work anymore. It only works if you need to load the data and then never reload it for whatever reason. So that's it for this episode. You will find the link to the repository and as well to a written article below. If you have any comments, or if you maybe have even an idea for an upcoming episode, please let me know as well, also in the comments, or maybe you send me a direct message on Twitter. Please subscribe to the channel, and yeah, thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.